So this month's video is a little bit different. We've got a special guest, and the special guest is Pale Sauni, who runs our cultural competency workshop, which is a 2-day workshop that we have on offer. And so I thought it'd be really interesting to get Pale along to have a chat about it, and so that you can get a real feel for what he's about and what the workshop's about. And so I'm just going to ask him some questions. We're just going to have a chat, and then hopefully you'll come away the wiser and really keen to get in and roll on the workshop. That'd be really awesome. So Pale, welcome.
Thank you.
So I know that you would rather you'd rather it that we called this cultural centeredness rather than cultural competency. So really keen to maybe start there and get you to talk a bit about that.
Sure. Talofa everyone, and thank you, Jacqui, for the opportunity to share in this way. So for people who are not familiar with this face, it's true Samoan-born, national Samoan face. Born in Samoa many years ago with my sister and then my parents, and we migrated to New Zealand in the early 50s actually, and lived in Auckland and had families in Auckland, and basically educated here in Aotearoa, New Zealand. It's a good question to ask, why cultural centeredness as opposed to cultural competency. My background's in social work and education. Often we talk about competency as something we've achieved, but I can clearly say, even as a Samoan that speaks my own language, I'm still trying to be competent in being Samoan. When we did a consultation of the 5 or 6 Pacific Island groups that are dominant here in Aotearoa, New Zealand, they said they preferred the word centeredness, because if I'm from Tonga or Niue or the Cook Islands or Samoa, you would center in on who I am as that ethnic specific group. And that's clear then. So you wouldn't call a Tongan a Samoan, and you wouldn't get involved in the mix-up that would happen culturally. And also there's some things that as Samoans we do quite differently to the other groups. And there are also things that we do the same together. I think the cultural competency part is achieving maybe a certificate of attendance, and then suddenly you're great with Pacific people. But in my life experience, no, that hasn't actually happened in that way. So the difference between the reality and the ideal is really clear. There is a sense too in which, in the centeredness, it brings the responsibility back to you as a person, as opposed to the ethnic group you're working to and working with. So if I was going to center on something, it would mean I would need to center, not the group have to try and jump through hoops to appeal to what I need to engage with them.
Yeah, that's so true.
It's a responsibility that I take. So centeredness is a really good thing. It's not common in other education initiatives, but particular for this one that I'm involved in. And I really do prefer people to have a cultural centeredness pathway if you're engaging with Pacific communities.
I love that. So you would have had a lot of experience in the past, which has led you to today to educate, inform the way that you are now compared to how you would have been, say, during your teens growing up in New Zealand, going to school in New Zealand, and then from there, with your work and stuff. So do you want to maybe share a little bit about what that looked like as a Samoan, a Samoan-born, coming to New Zealand and then trying to fit into the New Zealand culture? What was that like for you?
So this is probably better seen in terms of our arrival here in the 50s, and leaving behind things like people that were close to us in families, religions that were basically what centered our lives around belief, a language that was everyday spoken language, and an environment which was very much, Samoa was very primitive at the time when we moved across here. And arriving in New Zealand, we had to then embrace all the new things that New Zealand had. The families that were successful at that time were families that did both. They picked up their culture and sort of hold it in one hand, but also began to learn and embrace Aotearoa New Zealand's way of living and adjusting to. There are small things like when you had your first job, you had to read a pay slip, which was in English. So there's a sense of you wanted to know and learn, but there's also this feeling that, oh, you're just a second-rate worker who's come from the Pacific. So therefore, there was a sense of shame to have to feel like, I don't know about the tax system, so therefore I'm not going to get involved in even paying tax because I don't know what it means. And you're too shy to admit, because that was like saying, I don't know much. And so that feeling of shame was there. I remember as a single man, even working in a tire factory and getting my wages then. And some of the people around me were getting more than I was. And I was too shy to ask why. And really it was just because they spoke better English than I did. And they were able to identify with things quicker because of English than I would. So the whole thing about being Pacific as well is this notion of the individual and the collective. Very much as a Pacific person, you're in the collective from birth. Your family's a village concept. The individual is sometimes suppressed for the greater good. So those things happen. And so if you are a person like I was working in a factory and you experience things like racism or experience some abuse type thing, basically you were just told to just handle it because it was the whole family was more important than yourself. So it was really hard to come home and share those aspects. Where it became a lot more talked about was in the 70s, of course, when politically the Dawn raids took place and racism was really stood up. People would then comfortably talk about the Dawn raids as being very racist towards Pacific. And so, and then it got, because Pacific got around, of course, over those years and said, oh, well, it was just that a time, and it was just suppressed. And of course, the recent apology of the government now to Pacific was the beginning of trying to restore that relationship back with Pacific that was severed at that time. And interestingly, about that apology early on this year, the older Pacific communities were coming out and then admitting to the racism that happened to us during the 70s and the 80s. And so we're just trying now to redress that and provide some healing and some education around that. I'm certainly still involved in that in a very local community way. But the education is the answer for all of that stuff, just making sure everybody's on the same side about understanding how something like that Dawn raid as an incident can really affect the way Pacific people are mentally, culturally, socially, and academically.
It's really cool to hear your stories and your experiences, and then know that from that's created this person here with this cultural experience, and each person comes with their own. I always say there's a huge story behind every face, and that includes cultural as well as just a personal story, but the cultural information, that's a whole added layer that comes with each person. And I love that whole idea of understanding people better. That's what my life, my work, my journey is about, is understanding people better and helping them to understand themselves a lot better as well. And so, I find it awesome to hear you talk about your journey and the things that have made a positive impact on the way, but also, there's things that, you had to heal from as well in your past, as would maybe a Māori person that I'm talking to. I need to understand their path and what their journey's been, the waka that they've come in order to arrive at today and what that looks like, so that I can understand what they're about and what they, what I need to bring to the relationship in order to make sure it's a really healthy, harmonious, engaging, respectful relationship. Hey.
And that leads comfortably into that whole thing of why do we need to do that? And it's really clear. We don't live in a society now that doesn't know those things to do. We have Google now that explains everything. We've got internet where we can reach into places we've never reached before. So in some ways, we don't have an excuse not to engage with those people that we live in.
Mm.
In particular, the context for me is Aotearoa New Zealand. Less than 5 million people here. We can get this stuff right before the rest of the world. If we can't do it, then I think we're going to miss out. We're going to miss out on some of that really nice benefits of being able to understand another culture and be able to thrive and flourish. It's really more important now for every person in New Zealand, doesn't matter what race or culture. So how are we going to support that cultural change? And it really starts with me. It starts with my outlook. And to me, that's where I start the workshops, really. It's about looking at who I am. Where am I from? What are the things that I bring to this world? How do they gel with somebody else who's different? In fact, I was thinking about this the other day. If from 0 to 10 or 1 to 10, if you lined a Palangi person and a Pacific Island person, Samoan, next to each other, we'd probably have very similar things from 1 till about 7. So things like we eat, we breathe, we walk, we work, la, la, la. But perhaps between 7 and 10, we're quite different because there'll be a language, there'll be a nuance of that language, there'll be a faith in that language. And so those things would be quite different between me and another person. So really, cultural centeredness really, I think, is in those last 3 things. Yeah. And if we spent, 80% of our time learning about the 30% that's left, I think the chances are we won't feel so embarrassed or hurt or shy because, 70% of us is the same. Our physiology is the same, our existence is the same, we eat, breathe, all similar. It's just those 3 things. And that's where Pacific people will be quite different. One of the things about this workshop in terms of the cultural centeredness was to try and help educators really, or those who wanted to engage with our Pacific communities, to have tools to better strategize when they're working with our community so that they were able to engage more confidently in what we do. So that's really all it is. In case people think, you're supposed to have this amazing kind of, no, it's not one of those things. It's just from simple things like sometimes we'll think that just having our pronunciations correctly, people think, it's just a name. But a name is everything for a Pacific person. It's our culture, it's our family, it's our essence. If you pronounce my name rightly, I'm likely to trust you. And so if you're a teacher or if you're my boss and you say my name correctly, I'm likely to trust you. That's the principle behind getting our names right. So in the course, we just look at that in a fun way to try and get people to feel confident and comfortable to pronounce specific names or specific names of places, cities, greetings, the 7 ethnic groups that we work with here. We have a little fun exercise that gets people talking about that in the hope that people would have a sense that next time they're on their own, you might be a person in the cargo and there's a classroom full of Pacific Island kids. And instead of you going, oh my gosh, I'm just going to call them John and Janet and Jim, maybe you could look at the name and think, I remember that tool of separating the vowels, saying it really slowly, and then speeding it up until I'm confident. And when you can do that with every name, guess what? You can do it with Māori names as well.
Because you're centered on whichever ethnicity of person that you're dealing with. So, yeah.
So that's an important, again, an important part of the cultural centeredness workshop, which then leads to other things in the workshop about what do we need to be centered in. And so we'll talk about the Pacific Island values. And we know there's a number of those values in all our Indigenous ethnic groups. And if we center in on Tonga, we just look at the first 4 values that Tongans say are our important values. There's many, but at least if we start with 4, it gives you an opportunity to then begin to talk about. So if one of those values is respect, for example, is it the same for every ethnic group?
mm,
And we find out that it's not even the same for Pākehā. And so we
mm,
wouldn't expect to use the same value and behavior and attitude for that group if we're going to do it different for another. So
mm,
again, there's a lot of fun in that conversation.
mm.
So you got some of those things which people are afraid to talk about.
Yeah.
We can explore that in a safe place in the
Yes.
workshop.
That's what we found. We were privileged to attend Pale's workshop, and it was just fantastic. And that what Pale's saying about the safety was really important. That people felt really safe to be able to air their stuff that they were too afraid to ask anybody else. So Pale is such a what's the word, empathetic, and gets it. And so there's no non-judgmental. So it's a real non-judgmental safe space to be able to ask questions and not look stupid and not be judged for it too. Yeah.
Yeah.
Really cool.
The judgmental part has prevented people from attending workshops to learn more about other cultures.
Yeah.
And so I've been really determined not to let that be in the way in learning about some of the Pacific people. Other times, if we need to centre in on a Niuean or centre in on a Tongan, then I will get a Tongan and a Niuean to participate in that part of the workshop. So you can hear straight from the horse's mouth, as the Tongans would say. And so you try and engage with that ethnic specific group, because otherwise we just pan Pacific right across the whole lot.
Yeah, well, thank you, Pale. I mean, it's really good to just have this taster of how you speak and what you speak about. And you can see that Pale has so much knowledge and experience and a way about him that makes you quite comfortable to listen and quite comfortable to ask questions, as I've always found. So so I hope that those of you who are watching will feel really comfortable to even inquire about the two-day workshop, and we can tailor something that'll work, hey, Pale, that'll work for whether you're an individual or whether you're an organisation. So really appreciate your time, Pale, today to share.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. I think I can finish up by saying it's almost one of those workshops, anything you wanted to know about Pacific, but were too afraid to ask.
That's beautiful. Yeah, that's a great way to finish it. Yeah, perfect. Okay, we hope we see you there then at the workshop, the 2-day workshop with Pale.